Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into a truly monumental work, all 4 volumes of memoirs of the life, exile, and conversations of the Emperor Napoleon.
Wow.
As recorded by his devoted companion, Emmanuel de Las Cases.
What's remarkable about these memoirs is the sheer scope of Napoleon's life they cover.
Right.
We're not just talking about battlefield strategies or political maneuvering, though those are certainly present. These memoirs delve into his personal relationships, his philosophical musings, even his opinions on fashion.
Really?
It's a treasure trove of insights into the mind of one of history's most compelling figures.
So before we journey through Napoleon's life chronologically, let's give our listener a quick overview of the major themes that emerge from these volumes.
Sure.
What are some of the key takeaways that struck you?
Well, one overarching theme is Napoleon's unwavering belief in his own legitimacy as Emperor of France. He constantly emphasizes the role of the French people in his rise to power the plebiscites that validated his rule, and the fact that even foreign monarchs sought alliances with him.
Interesting.
He wants to solidify the idea that he wasn't a power-hungry dictator, but a leader chosen by destiny and by the people.
It's fascinating how he uses these memoirs to shape his own narrative, to combat what he saw as a smear campaign orchestrated by his enemies.
Absolutely. And interwoven with this theme of legitimacy is his military genius. He meticulously analyzes his campaigns, dissecting his victories and even his defeats with a surprising degree of honesty and self-awareness.
I see.
The Battle of Waterloo, for example, receives significant attention, with Napoleon lamenting missed opportunities, criticizing subordinates, and even speculating about possible treachery within his ranks.
It's like getting a masterclass in military strategy from one of history's greatest commanders.
And then, of course, there's the personal side of Napoleon.
Yeah.
We see his affection for Josephine, his hopes for his son, his frustrations with those he perceived as betraying him. He even dishes out some juicy gossip about the European courts, providing a glimpse into the intricate web of relationships and rivalries that shaped his era.
Okay, so we've got legitimacy, military brilliance, and a healthy dose of personal drama.
Sounds about right.
Let's start our chronological journey with Napoleon's early life. He wasn't born into a position of power, right?
Not at all. He was born in Corsica into a relatively modest family.
Okay.
But even in his youth, he displayed remarkable ambition and a thirst for knowledge. He excelled at military school, and his strategic brilliance was evident from his early victories like the Siege of Toulon. It was during this siege that he first caught the attention of powerful figures in the French government.
It's interesting how he credits individuals like Madame de Colombier with playing a crucial role in his early success.
Oh, yeah.
She provided him access to influential circles in Valence, essentially opening doors that might have otherwise remained closed to a young Corsican officer.
That's a crucial point. Napoleon recognized the importance of networks and relationships. He understood that talent alone wouldn't be enough. Yeah.
He needed to cultivate connections to position himself strategically within the corridors of power, and he did this masterfully throughout his career.
And it wasn't just social maneuvering. Napoleon seemed to have an innate understanding of his own potential. He pinpoints the Battle of Lodi as a turning point.
And really?
The moment he realized he could be more than just a brilliant military mind. He could be a political force to be reckoned with.
Exactly, he writes. It was after Lodi that the idea entered my head that I might become a decisive player on the political scene.
Wow.
Lodi was a pivotal victory, not just militarily, but psychologically.
I see.
It solidified his self-belief and set him on a course that would ultimately lead him to the pinnacle of power in France.
And that brings us to the coup d'etat that installed him as first consul. It's fascinating how he describes this pivotal moment not as a power grab, but as a necessary action to restore order and stability to a nation teetering on the brink of chaos.
He positions himself as the savior of France, the man who could bring an end to the turmoil of the revolution and usher in an era of peace and prosperity.
And to a large extent, he delivered on those promises.
Let's talk about those reforms. He wasted no time in implementing sweeping changes across France, from the establishment of the Bank of France to the creation of the Napoleonic Code, a legal system that still influences many countries today.
These reforms were about consolidating his power, of course, but they also genuinely aimed at modernizing and strengthening France. The Napoleonic Code in particular was a radical departure from the fragmented and often arbitrary legal systems of the past. It introduced principles of equality before the law, secularism, and property rights that had a profound impact on French society and beyond.
And then came the grand spectacle of his coronation as emperor, with Pope Pius VII himself in attendance.
Pretty impressive, right?
What was the significance of that event?
It was a masterstroke of political theater. Napoleon understood the power of symbolism.
Yeah.
By having the Pope present, he was essentially legitimizing his rule in the eyes of the Catholic Church and the deeply religious French population.
It's interesting that Napoleon, despite being a product of the Enlightenment, recognized the importance of appealing to traditional sources of authority.
He was a pragmatist. He understood that to secure his power, he needed to build a broad base of support. And that meant weaving together elements of the old and the new, the secular and the religious.
Right.
It was a delicate balancing act, but one he managed with remarkable skill.
And speaking of calculated moves, Napoleon casually mentions that he could have married a Russian princess.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the geopolitical ramifications of that union.
Indeed, a Franco-Russian alliance at that time could have reshaped the entire European landscape. It could have potentially prevented the Napoleonic Wars, or at least altered their course dramatically. But instead, he chose Marie-Louise of Austria.
Why do you think he made that choice? Was it purely political?
I think it was a combination of factors. Securing an alliance with Austria was certainly a strategic priority, especially given his ongoing conflicts with other European powers. But I also believe personal considerations played a role in his memoirs. Napoleon describes Marie-Louise as a sweet and gentle woman, a stark contrast to the fiery and independent Josephine.
Oh.
Perhaps he was seeking a more traditional, subservient wife, someone who wouldn't challenge his authority.
It's a reminder that even in the life of a man like Napoleon, personal desires and political calculations were often intertwined.
Absolutely. And this tension between the personal and the political is a recurring theme throughout these memoirs. It adds a layer of complexity to his character, making him more relatable, even as we marvel at his ambition and accomplishments.
So we've seen Napoleon rise from relative obscurity to become the Emperor of France. He's implemented sweeping reforms, secured strategic alliances, and positioned himself as the arbiter of European affairs, but of course his story is far from over.
Indeed, the next chapter of our journey will take us into the heart of the Napoleonic Wars, where we'll witness his military genius firsthand and explore the consequences of his insatiable ambition. Welcome back to our deep dive into Napoleon's memoirs. As we saw in Part 1, Napoleon's rise to power was a combination of strategic brilliance, political maneuvering, and perhaps a healthy dose of good fortune. But his reign wasn't all about coronations and reforms. His name became synonymous with a series of conflicts that swept across Europe, the Napoleonic Wars.
That's right. Napoleon wasn't just content with ruling France. He envisioned himself as the architect of a new European order, and he was willing to wage war to achieve that vision.
And in these memoirs, we get to see those wars through his eyes. He meticulously analyzes his campaigns, detailing his strategies, highlighting key decisions, and even offering critiques of his own actions and those of his subordinates.
For example, his invasion of Russia in 1812. It's a campaign that has fascinated historians for centuries, and in these memoirs we get Napoleon's own perspective on this colossal undertaking.
He frames the invasion as a necessary response to Russian aggression, arguing that Tsar Alexander I was a duplicitous and untrustworthy ally. He details the challenges of marching an army across such vast distances, the logistical nightmares, the scorching summer heat, and the brutal Russian winter that ultimately decimated his forces.
It's interesting how he tries to downplay the scale of the defeat, arguing that the retreat from Moscow was a strategic withdrawal, not a rout. But even he can't completely mask the bitterness of that experience.
There's a passage where he describes the horrors of the retreat, the frozen corpses littering the road, the starving soldiers succumbing to the cold. He writes, "From the sublime to the ridiculous is but a step. It's a rare moment of vulnerability, a glimpse into the human cost of his grand ambitions."
But it's not just the big picture strategy that he focuses on. He also delves into the specifics of individual battles, like Austerlitz, often considered his greatest tactical masterpiece.
Austerlitz was a triumph of strategic planning and battlefield execution. Napoleon describes how he anticipated the enemy's movements, lured them into a trap, and then unleashed a devastating attack that shattered their forces. He breaks down the battle in detail, explaining his thought process, highlighting key decisions, and even critiquing some of his own generals for their hesitation or lack of initiative.
It's like getting a master class in military tactics from the master himself.
And while he celebrates his victories, he also dissects his defeats. He spends a considerable amount of time reflecting on the Battle of Waterloo, the final nail in the coffin of his empire.
Waterloo is fascinating because we get Napoleon's own analysis of what went wrong. He blames the rain that delayed his attack, the late arrival of crucial reinforcements, and the questionable actions of some of his marshals, particularly Marshal Grouchy.
He even hints at possible treachery within his ranks, suggesting that Marshal Soult, his chief of staff, may have deliberately sabotaged his efforts. It's a testament to the paranoia and distrust that can fester even at the highest levels of power.
And beyond the battlefield, these memoirs offer a window into the complexities of European diplomacy during this tumultuous period. Napoleon describes his dealings with other monarchs like Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Emperor Francis II of Austria, revealing the shifting alliances, the betrayals, and the constant maneuvering for power that characterize the age.
He's particularly scathing in his assessment of British politicians, especially William Pitt the Younger, whom he accuses of orchestrating a continental coalition against him out of pure spite and jealousy.
But it's not all politics and war. These memoirs also shed light on Napoleon's personal life, his relationships, his passions, and his regrets.
He speaks with genuine affection about Josephine, his first wife, highlighting their shared love of art, their intellectual discussions, and their passionate, if sometimes tumultuous, relationship. He even acknowledges her extravagance, which often frustrated him, but seems to view it with a mix of exasperation and fondness.
And then there's his second marriage to Marie-Louise, a union driven primarily by political considerations. He describes her as a gentle and obedient woman, a stark contrast to Josephine. But one can sense a certain distance, in his words, a lack of the passion that characterized his first marriage.
He clearly loved Josephine deeply, and even after their divorce, her presence looms large in these memoirs. He speaks of her with a tenderness and regret that are absent from his descriptions of Marie-Louise. It's a reminder that even a man who reshaped the map of Europe couldn't entirely control the matters of the heart.
And let's not forget the gossip Napoleon clearly enjoyed dishing about the scandals and intrigues of European courts.
He spills the tea on everyone from the Prince of Wales to Tsar Alexander I. He talks about their love affairs, their eccentricities, their political machinations. He even claims to have intimate knowledge of secret treaties and hidden alliances, revealing a world of backstabbing and double-dealing that would make even the most seasoned diplomat blush.
It's all very entertaining, but how much of it can we take at face value?
That's a good question. Napoleon was a master manipulator both on the battlefield and in the drawing room. It's likely he embellished some stories, omitted inconvenient truths, and presented himself in the most favorable light possible.
So you have to read these memoirs with a critical eye, understanding that they're as much about self-promotion as they are about historical accuracy.
Absolutely. But even with that caveat, these memoirs offer an invaluable window into Napoleon's mind, his worldview, and his understanding of the events that shaped his life and the destiny of Europe.
And as his power begins to crumble, as his enemies close in, we see a shift in his tone. He becomes more introspective, more philosophical, even more vulnerable.
He grapples with the consequences of his actions, acknowledges the human cost of his wars, and expresses regret for some of his decisions. He even reflects on his legacy, pondering how history will judge him.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore this more introspective side of Napoleon. His reflections on exile, his attempts to shape his narrative, and his hopes for the future. We've journeyed with Napoleon from the sun-drenched battlefields of Italy to the icy plains of Russia, witnessing his meteoric rise and his devastating fall. And now in these final volumes of his memoirs, we find him confined to the remote island of Saint Helena, stripped of his power and forced to confront his own mortality.
It's a remarkable transformation. The once indefatigable emperor, the man who seemed to bend destiny to his will, is now reduced to a prisoner, his days filled with reflection, introspection, and a desperate attempt to control how history will remember him.
And that desire to shape his narrative becomes almost an obsession in these later volumes. He meticulously recounts his achievements, defends his decisions, and often attempts to shift blame for his failures onto others.
Take, for example, his exile to Elba after his first abdication. He portrays it as a voluntary retreat, a strategic maneuver to outwit his enemies and ultimately regain power. He even suggests that he was treated with respect and admiration by the British during his time on Elba, painting a picture that's quite at odds with historical accounts.
It's clear that he's crafting a narrative that emphasizes his own agency, his cunning, and his unwavering belief in his own destiny.
Precisely. He wants to be seen as a master strategist even in defeat. And this self-mythologizing continues throughout his account of his escape from Elba, his triumphant return to France, and the 100 Days' War that culminated in the Battle of Waterloo.
Waterloo, of course, marks his final downfall. And while he acknowledges his mistakes, he also spends considerable time justifying his decisions, laying blame on subordinates and highlighting factors beyond his control, such as the weather and the treachery of allies.
It's fascinating to see him wrestling with this defeat. He analyzes the battle in meticulous detail, offering alternative scenarios, speculating on what might have been had certain decisions been made differently. There's a sense that he's trying to convince himself as much as his readers that Waterloo wasn't a complete disaster, that it could have been salvaged had fate been a bit kinder.
But amidst these attempts to control his narrative, there are also moments of genuine introspection, of grappling with the weight of his actions and the consequences of his ambition.
He reflects on the human cost of his wars, acknowledging the countless lives lost, the families shattered, the nations devastated. There's a passage where he writes, "The sight of a battlefield after the fight is enough to inspire princes with the love of peace and horror of war." It's a rare glimpse into the moral burden he carried, the understanding that his pursuit of glory came at a terrible price.
And his reflections on his relationships reveal a more vulnerable side. He speaks of Josephine with a tenderness and regret that are palpable. He laments the political pressures that forced them apart, acknowledging that their divorce was one of his greatest regrets.
There's a particularly poignant passage where he describes seeing a portrait of Josephine while in exile on Saint Helena. He writes, "Her image never left me, it followed me everywhere." It's a testament to the depth of his love for her, a love that transcended ambition and the allure of power.
And then there's his son, the King of Rome, Napoleon's heir apparent whom he never saw again after his exile. His hopes and dreams for his son are evident throughout these memoirs. He yearns for him to inherit his legacy, to rule France, to achieve the greatness that eluded him.
He envisions a future where his son unites Europe, bringing peace and prosperity to the continent. He fills pages with advice for his son, urging him to be strong, decisive, and always vigilant against enemies both foreign and domestic. It's a father's desperate attempt to guide his son from afar, to shape his destiny from beyond the grave.
But there's also a sense of melancholy, of resignation in these passages. Napoleon knows that his own dreams lie shattered, that his time on the world stage is over. He's left to grapple with the legacy he'll leave behind, the empire that crumbled, the wars that consumed Europe.
And in these final reflections, we see a man stripped bare, forced to confront his own flaws and the limitations of his power. He acknowledges the mistakes he made, the opportunities squandered, the alliances betrayed.
He even admits to moments of vanity, of arrogance, of allowing his ambition to cloud his judgment. It's a remarkable confession from a man who spent much of his life crafting an image of invincibility.
And yet, even in these moments of vulnerability, there's a flicker of defiance, a refusal to completely surrender to despair. He clings to the belief that history will ultimately judge him fairly, that his achievements will outweigh his failures.
He writes, "History will judge me. It will weigh in the balance the good that I have done and the evil." It's a plea for understanding, a hope that future generations will see him as a complex figure, a man driven by grand visions, but also susceptible to human fallibility.
And that, perhaps, is the most enduring legacy of these memoirs. They don't offer easy answers. They don't provide a definitive judgment on Napoleon's life and actions. They offer something far more profound, an invitation to engage with the complexities of history, to grapple with the contradictions of human nature, and to recognize that even the most towering figures are ultimately shaped by the forces of their time and the frailties of their own humanity.
So, listeners, we encourage you to delve into these memoirs yourselves, to immerse yourselves in the world of Napoleon Bonaparte, and to draw your own conclusions about this extraordinary and endlessly fascinating figure. Until next time, keep those pages turning.